Good afternoon. We're back. You're at live.leftword.com, the May Day celebration from LeftWord Books and May Day Bookstore. Today is May Day, the day of the International Workers' celebration, started as a consequence of the 8-hour day struggle. First took place in India in 1923 by our comrade Singravelu in Chennai. This is a very important year for us in India. It's the 100th anniversary of the trade union movement, the formal trade union movement. It's also very important. It's the 100th anniversary of India's communist movement. The Communist Party was founded in 1920, 100 years ago. It's a very big year for the working class and communist movement. Therefore, entirely, my great privilege personally, but also politically, to have joining us now the former General Secretary of the Communist Party of India, Marxist, the Polit Bureau member of the CPIM, the really leader and guider of LeftWord Books in many ways, the editor of the very first book that LeftWord produced, A World to Win, essays on the Communist Manifesto, which included the manifesto. Most recently, a tremendous collection, Revolution, Lenin in 1917, with an introduction that shows very sharply how Lenin has to be understood, must be understood. Soon, Prakash Karat is going to provide for LeftWord an edition of What is to be Done by Lenin, with an introduction by himself. So welcome to live.leftword.com, Comrade Prakash Karat.
Thank you, and I'd like to take this opportunity to convey my warmest May Day greetings to all of you who are viewing this.
Well, it's a difficult May Day because obviously we are in the great lockdown. The International Labour Organization has said that about 2.7 billion workers are not able to be at work or make a proper living. The ILO has also said that $3.5 trillion US dollars will be lost to the workers in this period. This is a minimum amount. This is a really catastrophic attack at workers. At the same time, it's the largest imposed general strike. And this general strike, where labor has been withdrawn from the economy, has sort of proved Karl Marx's point that it's labor that creates value and not, the entrepreneurs and the capitalists. Give us a sense of how you are seeing this great lockdown from the standpoint of the world's workers.
Well, the ILO has also said that half the global workforce is going to be unemployed. It's a mind-boggling figure. But what it means is that we had, through the pandemic, the coronavirus pandemic, a global health emergency. And this is not anymore a health emergency. There is a total breakdown of the economic systems, and there is an economic and social crisis which is going to be an outcome of this pandemic. And how the rulers of the various countries and the governments are going to deal with this pandemic or are dealing with this pandemic is actually heightening or perpetuating this economic and social crisis. So we are going to see, of course, from the workers' point of view, the working class is going to bear the brunt of this crisis, and bear the brunt of this crisis in the way the rulers are going to try to solve the problems. We all know how the traditional method, they'll bail out the big corporates, the big banks, the financial institutions. We saw after 2008 financial crisis, the long period of austerity which was imposed on the working people in most of Europe. So we know how they are going to deal with this. So there is a multi-dimensional crisis which is going to affect not only the workers, but I think people in general and society in general. And that's something, that's a big challenge. How are we going to meet this? How are we going to face this? How are we going to overcome it? Because there will be two clear ways. One, which is ordained, which is already set in motion, where the ruling circles, the ruling classes, the various countries are going to see how they can protect the interests of the corporates and the big banks and the super rich, while throwing to the wolves literally the people, whether it's a question of their jobs, their livelihood, their social security, all the benefits that they gained after several decades of struggle, all that is being washed off.
It's amazing to see how, you're quite right. There's a callousness in the way in which these governments have operated towards the pandemic. I mean, this sudden lockdown, for instance, migrant workers just told, take to the streets, etc. There's a callousness. But also it strikes me that there was, or maybe there's not, there was a lack of understanding of how supply chains work. And in India in particular, how agriculture is going to be damaged. I mean, who's going to take care of the next crop, the harvesting, the sowing, and so on? Tell us a little bit about what you anticipate, this government doing in terms of making sure there's not a total breakdown of the entire supply chain of food and other things.
Well, now it's going to be 40 days of the lockdown by the 3rd of May. And we have seen in this entire period, the government is not put in place any measures to meet with this massive economic disruption, the disruption of supply chain that you mentioned, the question of how agricultural operations can continue and be sustained. Nothing has been planned for, even proposed. Everybody had thought that after the first round of the lockdown, after the 3 weeks, they'd come out with at least a package, a stimulus package and also relief measures package. But nothing has come so far. This shows the total callousness, not only callousness. It was astonishing to hear the Prime Minister say in the meeting of the chief ministers held just a few days ago that the economy is in good condition. This is the words he used. The economy is in good shape. Which world is he living in? You see. So it is, I think, more a callousness. As long as they can protect the interests of big business, protect the interests of the international finance capital in India, I think the government is not really bothered, because there's no other reason why they are still sticking to fiscal conservatism. The rigid adherence to this 3%, you see, of the limit that is there, the FRBM Act. They're not allowing the states. All the states are in dire condition now, because they are the ones who have to actually do the work for meeting the problems caused by the lockdown. They have to see that the food supply is there. They have to see that shelter is provided. They have to see that health care facilities are there. All this expenditure is borne by the state governments. But can you imagine the last 40 days, the government has not even allowed them to increase the borrowing limit. They want to borrow money, even that is not being allowed. So the whole approach is that we know that the people of this country will be with us. Modi is confident of that. They are confident of that the divisive politics which they have been practicing will divert the people's attention, because we have seen in this very short period of a few weeks, we have seen how the communal issue has got exacerbated. You are seeing that there's a serious campaign attempt to hold Muslims responsible for this corona pandemic. They're talking in terms of the corona jihad. So you have a situation where every social and economic contradiction or conflict which existed in our society, all of them are going to get intensified or exacerbated because of this approach of the Modi government.
No, I think it's quite shameful how they have communalized this pandemic. I mean, their own incompetence, they're hiding behind communalism. It's just like the Western governments who are hiding behind their incompetence with anti-China rhetoric. Always blame somebody else. Don't be, so much for responsibility. The neoliberal thing, you're supposed to take responsibility. But none of these governments, the United States government, the Italian government, the Indian government, Brazilian, none of them have the concept of responsibility. It's a shameful approach that they divert blame.
Yes, you're right. And in fact, from the experience of this pandemic in India, when we look back and introspect, I think one of the major lessons to be learned is the criminal neglect of the public health system in India. India has one of the most privatized health systems. We spend just about 1% of the GDP on public health expenditure. The out-of-pocket expenditure of a household constitutes 70% of the total expenditure on health in India. This is one of the highest ratios that people have to pay from their pockets. This is one of the major sources of the perpetuation of poverty and destitution in India. But it's a failure of I would say, not only the government, but I think the entire political class in India have failed to make health people's issue, which is a basic issue, a policy matter, that public health systems have to be built up. The little that Kerala has done to strengthen the public health system has shown these great results in tackling the pandemic. But all over the country today, what we are finding is, despite all the discussions about various aspects of how we are failing to really, on the medical front, on the health front, tackle this pandemic, the reality is that we have a very weak, very debilitated public health system. And the first thing to be done, I think, out of this whole experience would be to, I don't know whether this government will ever think about it, but the first thing, urgent priority would be to spend. Government should spend money and build up at least rudimentary infrastructure of public health for the entire country.
In February, the current head of the World Health Organization, Dr. Tedros, he gave a very important speech, but in that speech, there was a line that really stuck with me. He said, health is a political issue. And I think what he meant, and I'd like you to reflect on that, I think he was really talking about exactly this, that governments over the last, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, in 1978, the WHO held a meeting in Alma-Ata in the USSR, where they passed the Alma-Ata Declaration on Public Health. Very expansive, reasoned, science-based approach to the need for public health. At least since 1978, no movement on it. And so Dr. Tedros says, health is a political issue. Please reflect on that a little bit. I think people should really understand what that means.
I think precisely health is a political issue, which means health is a people's issue. That is why it is a political issue. It is a fundamental issue for the people, and therefore it is a political issue. All policy matters concerning health are basically a political decision. Do you want to develop a public health system, or do you want to privatize health? This government has adopted a national health policy which incentivizes the private sector in health, which is actually promoting privatization. The Niti Aayog had put out a paper which says that even district level hospitals should have public-private collaboration, which means the district hospital will be taken over by the private sector also. So this is the approach that they have, just like they have towards public educational system. You have schools after schools closing down, government schools in various states, you see. In Kerala, the last 3.5 years, we have sought to reverse this. Kerala has a very large private sector in health. People don't know that. We have a public health system which is reasonably good, but still the majority is still in the private sector. But we have upgraded the public health system to the extent that people have started now coming back to the government hospitals. Similarly, in public education, schools are being closed because there are no students. Parents want to send their children to private schools because there's no worthwhile education in the public educational system. We have now, in 3 years, been able to reverse that also. We are finding a flow back into the public educational system in the government schools. So what I'm saying is that this is a political issue. If you follow the neoliberal paradigm, then the logic is private sector should be there in the health and education, and they should be the main providers of health and education. So this is a political question, whether you want to, the neoliberal philosophy, which is everything is to be put in the market, and then profits are the primary motive for developing the health and education sector. So I think it is a political issue, and I think that not only in India, I think worldwide, after this experience of this pandemic, this question is going to be posed very sharply about the public health system. Even in the United Kingdom, the National Health Service has been run down, has been diluted. Piecemeal privatization has taken place. That is why today, even then it's better, the health system is, public health system, better than many other countries, but even they are facing a serious problem in tackling the present health crisis. So I think health is an issue on which particularly the left in India must make this a major question in their future agenda.
I think this is quite right. The UN, in fact, about 3 years ago, published a high-level report on health workers, a very important report where they said that the commission was chaired by Gro Brundtland, who used to be the head of the World Health Organization. And in the report, they calculated that by 2030, there'll be a deficit globally of between 18 and 20 million healthcare workers. This in India, of course, comes down not only to doctors, nurses, and so on, but also the ASHA workers, the public health workers, and so on. Huge international deficit. This was 4 or 5 years ago. I'd like to come back in a little bit to Kerala, because I think that's an important area for us to spend some time. But let's come to what you said a second ago, which is this that the government in India is unwilling to lift the ceiling on spending in this time of emergency, at a time when, let's say, the Financial Times, it's a good example of a reasonable, rational business, capitalist media, but reasonable and rational. The Financial Times and its main intellectual, Martin Wolf, have been banging on about the need to lift all the stops and spend like crazy to save capitalism. I mean, they are saying this from the centerpiece, intellectual heart of neoliberalism. Why aren't the people in India listening?
Here, the government has, in the first package announced, 1.3 7 crore package, 1 crore 70 lakhs package, you found that half the package is already provisioned for, funds already provided for in the budget. So you had hardly 0.5% of the GDP which was provided for additional funding or expenditure, about 90,000 crores of rupees. So here everybody, like the Financial Times, even the bourgeois economists, as they call them, or the section corporate media has already said you can spend at least 5% of the GDP for additional, funding for all these activities. But the government has not budged. And neither are they letting the states, giving them any leeway. Forget about borrowing. They're not even paying them their arrears which they are owed. All the states are clamoring for it. Some are saying we are owed 5,000 crores because of GST collection, the compensation due. We are owed 3,000 crores as MNREGS dues, the wages, rural employment guarantee wages. So every state, including the BJP state governments, are clamoring for more funds, but the central government just refuses. Just take the latest case when they have said that migrant workers can now go back to their home states. But the state government's concern must arrange the buses, spend the money, and take them back. Even that interstate transfer, central government will not take any responsibility. And this is not a few thousands. This is going to be millions of people eventually who will have to move up and down. And Kerala has said where 3 lakh migrant workers are immediately ready to leave, we have said that we can't send them by buses. Neither can the government afford it, nor is it practical to send people thousands of kilometers away by buses. You arrange for special trains. We have raised this matter for the last 3 weeks, but so far the central government has not agreed. So the approach of the central government is completely neoliberal and conservative as far as additional funding is concerned.
A reasonable person, with some sensitivity, looking at the behavior of the central government in India, has a few options to understand why is the government behaving like this. It's callous. That's one. Secondly, it's heartless. That's another. I mean, what are the other options? One of them is it's incompetent. It doesn't understand what's happening. It's cut off from reality. I mean, you see, because even from a neoliberal perspective, one would say spend money now, protect the supply chain, make sure agriculture isn't eroded and destroyed. Even from a neoliberal perspective, in a crisis, spend to protect the system. Seemingly, they are not even interested in that kind of thinking. How does one explain to a sensitive, inquisitive person the actions of the Indian government?
This is Hindutva economics. That's all I can say. We don't understand it.
It is difficult to understand. I mean, it's perplexing. The issue you raised with the states, I think, is a very important one, and it predates the pandemic, which is what in India is called federalism. The states having certain amount of power. And the finance minister of Kerala, in fact, had a book with LeftWord on fiscal federalism. This argument that states need to have some more control over their budgetary processes, their monetary policy, fiscal policy, and so on. Could you talk a little bit about why the BJP central government in particular? I mean, I think it's unusual even amongst bourgeois governments in India, why the BJP central government has been so against federalism and trying to centralize certain things, but they are quite happy to federalize solutions to problems, as we see in the pandemic. States must deal with it.
I think it's a matter of degree. There has been, if you look at the long term, a trend towards centralization of power and resources in India. And it's only a particular junctures or periods when the central government was weak. It was a sort of coalition where the Congress party or the BJP did not have a majority and they had to adjust, that there was some scope, some space for the states. But otherwise, under successive Congress governments, the centralization has taken place. The BJP has carried it forward to a higher degree. Today also, on the matter of health, health is a state subject. Epidemics and diseases come under the center. But without the states dealing with this problem, health is under them, you can't really tackle the problem. But we are getting some guidelines from the center in the name of the Disaster Management Act that they have overriding powers, which really do not fit the necessities or needs of that state. You can't have one size fit all for a country like India. So this sort of centralization, which has now assumed its most acute form in the financial aspect, the fiscal centralization, whether it is the FRBM Act, whether it is the GST, which has taken away whatever limited powers of taxation the states had, and the way the Finance Commission terms of references are being set. The Finance Commission is a constitutional body which is supposed to divide up the resources between the center and states. The general trend is towards the centralization of all powers and resources in the hands of the center, and the states have been reduced to mendicants now. They have to go with a begging bowl before the center to get some funds. I think many of the state governments here are envious of the governors of the United States in the various states. They have much more power as governors to deal with this pandemic than any of the state governments.
It's quite, I mean, what you say is quite shocking that a country which is essentially a union of, union of states, that you'd imagine that is a constitutional right of states to determine certain things, as you say, health and so on. If you don't have control over your finances.
I'm sorry to say, it's a constitutional fiction. India as a union of states, it's a constitutional fiction.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, one says if you want to understand the morality of a government or a regime, don't look at the constitution, look at the budget. The budget is a much better reflection of the actual values of a government than the constitution it's supposed to live up to. So, yes, I want to actually spend a little time directly on Kerala because, Kerala is a state in the Indian Union. It's currently governed by the Left Democratic Front. I was quite amused actually to see the Chief Minister of Kerala, Pinarayi Vijayan, come on television and being asked, why isn't the central government, why isn't Mr. Modi listening to you or following your lead? Because the government of Kerala, like really the parallel is Vietnam, very quickly responded to news from Wuhan, very quickly developed a science-based approach to what was happening. Could you talk a little bit, about what you understand to be, how Kerala operated and why this is something that people should take very seriously?
Well, as I said, over decades, the efforts put in to build a public health care system in Kerala has paid off now. Though I still think that much more needs to be done to make this a better public health system. But the little bit that was done, and this was done, I am not claiming only by this government, but there is a whole history of public action in Kerala, which has helped to create this consciousness that we need a good public health system and a good public educational system, a good public distribution system, ration system. Kerala has a good PDS system, by the way, also. So this has been achieved through decades of public action and also by governments, mainly the left-led governments, because as you know, in Kerala, there's always been this alternation between the left-led government and the Congress-led government. So, but we have been able, because we have been coming back to power every 5 years, we have resumed some of the work which was disrupted in the interregnum, and we have been able to carry it forward. So in Kerala, the public health system and other determinants, social and economic determinants, that is the public distribution system, the educational system, and decentralization of powers. That's very important. All the work being done now, the nitty-gritty of tackling the pandemic and the problems of the lockdown are being undertaken by the local bodies. Community kitchens are being run by all the panchayats. The house-to-house surveillance, monitoring, all that is being done with the help of volunteers who have been enrolled. More than 330,000 volunteers. Army has been constituted, and they are the ones under the guidance of the local bodies doing this work. So it is not just the health system per se, but the whole setup, the social setup with all these collective bodies working, the Kudumbashri, the women's self-help groups. They are the ones doing the bulk of the food preparations which have to be supplied. Even some of the migrant camps, there are Kudumbashri groups doing it. So you have this whole network of institutions, cooperatives. This has been built up over decades, and through public action and also through left intervention. And of course, other forces have been there. You'll find in Kerala, what is called civil society, even religious bodies. You'll find greater enlightened social consciousness among all the religious bodies there. All the religious, the churches, the mosques, the temple authorities have contributed to all this work. For example, much of the quarantining we're going to do, now lakhs of people are going to come back from the Gulf. Most of the religious institutions have made their establishments available for their rooms, guest rooms, etc., various things for this. So there is a social consciousness which has developed in Kerala, civic consciousness which has developed in Kerala, which I think is what has contributed to this limited success so far.
I think this is a real dividing line between a society which has allowed itself to be fragmented and atomized, and a sort of socialistic society where there are organizations, trade unions, women's groups, cooperatives, and so on. It's a real dividing line to, if you look at, say, Venezuela against maybe Colombia, you see this as well. In Venezuela, it's all public action, enormous amounts of public action. It's an erroneous idea that people have of socialism, that socialism is the state imposing its policies. It's public action that's the heart of it. I want to actually switch gears a little bit. One of the things, again, that comes up in a situation like this is we look, admirably at Cuba sending its doctors abroad. Now, China sending medical personnel to Iran, to Italy, to Venezuela, and so on. At the same time, the United States government is continuing to intensify pressure against Iran. In fact, has sent a fleet of ships to blockade Venezuela. Yesterday, Donald Trump signed a decree asking for the National Guard to be called out, essentially to prosecute hostilities against Venezuela on the counter-narcotics thing. I mean, it seems a clear-cut difference. Some parts of the world want to send doctors abroad, others want to overthrow governments. Tell us a little bit about this thing that, we call imperialism.
Well, the pandemic is being utilized in this way to try for imperialism to maintain its hegemony, or to prevent any challenge to its hegemony. This is what is happening. You mentioned all the hostile moves against Iran and Venezuela and Cuba. One more thing was there. It looks like a very small thing, but it shows the attitude of the American government. Cuba was going to receive a consignment of medical supplies from Jack Ma, the Jack Ma Foundation. He's got a big foundation. He is already, I think, sent supplies free to about 120 countries. The consignment to Cuba was stopped because the company which was taking the consignment recently has changed hands. American have taken over that company. So they said, no, nothing can be taken to Cuba. And the consignment was aborted. So Cuba was not given even medical supplies. We have seen this happening. Iran cannot get IMF loan. Venezuela cannot get an IMF loan. They've been denied IMF loan. So under this pandemic, the United States of America is in its desperation because it knows it has made a hash of the whole issue domestically, but still, on one hand, it tries to throw the whole blame on China and whip up anti-China sentiment, which it hopes Trump will use it for these elections also coming in November. And secondly, it is actually becoming more aggressive against its so-called adversaries or who they think are its enemies. They're going all out to use this critical time to suppress these countries and their governments. This is you cannot believe this can happen, but this shows the real inhuman and predatory nature of an imperialist power like the United States of America.
I mean, it's what's also shocking is that for the last 25 odd years, people have been saying things like, well, there's no imperialism anymore. Now you sort of have to deal rationally in an interstate system and, blah, blah, blah. And then this happens. You have the UN Secretary General saying, everybody, let's have a global ceasefire. Let's concentrate our energies on the pandemic. And you have this situation where the United States, rather than loosening its attempt to strangle these countries, is tightening it. I mean, one hopes that this is going to clarify for people that this thing that we call imperialism is not anachronistic. It's real, and I want to bring the discussion back to India on this, because it seems that within India, this anti-China thing is picking up. And,
yes.
Could you talk a little bit about this? Because it's another way for India. One way you had mentioned was you divert attention by saying, well, it's Muslims who are to communalize the pandemic. The other way, as you had mentioned earlier, is to blame China for it. Talk a little bit about this attempt by even forces in India to shift the burden of responsibility from this government to China.
You see, Mike Pompeo has recently stated that he's had a number of conversations with our foreign minister, our Indian foreign minister. And he said that we talked about our joint fight against the COVID pandemic, what measures we have to do, etc. But he said also the bigger issues about a free Indo-Pacific, the challenge of China, and supply chains. The Americans are now telling India, just like Japan has now tried to withdraw some of its investments in China. You curtail economic ties with China. You must take over the place of China as far as some of the supply chains are concerned. Some of the companies which are there operating in China, why don't you get them over? And right on cue, all the Indian ministers in the cabinet are today talking about attracting those companies and investments from China into India. And unlike Bolsonaro or Trump, Modi does not directly say anything against China as far as the pandemic is concerned. But if you look at the social media, all the Hindutva walas, what are they saying? What are they campaigning? Internally, Muslims are to blame for the COVID virus. Externally, China is to blame for the COVID virus. So this is the ideological framework of the right-wing Hindutva forces that blame Muslims internally and blame China externally. So you have this, India is very much in the camp of America's allies like Brazil or Israel or Japan, who will go along with America's anti-China campaign. So we have to wait and see how exactly this will pan out, because I think there are a lot of other countervailing factors for, if India tries to go on this path, it's going to really be harmful for India. When we are in such deep crisis, when we are facing such a total breakdown of our economy, to try to make this into an anti-China thing, which will translate in terms of economic relations, I think we'll be cutting our nose, spite our face. Yeah.
And it's also irrational. I mean, just to say that Wuhan or Hubei province was a center of high-tech manufacturing, as it turns out. And, a lot of German companies were based in Wuhan and so on. And the advantages of China was that the workforce was healthy. It didn't suffer chronic malnutrition. It had high literacy rates. It was, basically a disciplined workforce, able to work, without falling ill. The constant illnesses in the Indian workforce are a result of malnutrition, lack of care, lack of public health, as you said. You can't just shift the supply chain to India. I mean, India would have to up the public health spending. India would have to up the nutritional rate for the workers and so on. The very things we've just talked about the government not doing, you would have to do if you want to attract the value chain. It's not so easy.
No, it's not at all. Yeah.
I mean,
okay.
You mentioned the other thing we have about 10 minutes or so, but I want you to tell us a little bit, because it's not much talked about. You mentioned the Indo-Pacific strategy. This includes Australia, Japan, so on. Could you talk a little bit about this Indo-Pacific strategy? Because I think it's part of this conversation of India's role in the world.
Well, I'm old-fashioned, so I still talk about it as the Asia-Pacific strategy. That was what America used to talk about, the Asia-Pacific strategy. And now this ploy to make it Indo-Pacific is basically to draw India fully into the geopolitical game of the United States in Asia. And it is succeeding. I don't want to go into the details. The military collaboration has reached a stage where we have sent a liaison officer to the Pacific Command. We sent one to the Central Command. And for the Trump administration, India is a key factor in the containment of China, or a countervailing factor which they want to utilize or exploit fully. But that is not our strategic priority or interest. It's their strategic priority or interest, which we are now playing into. So the Indo-Pacific is primarily a strategic and military program in which India is immersed in now without having any benefit for itself. So this is one aspect. The other is that you've seen in this pandemic also how America has behaved with India. Trump demanded that you send the hydroxychloroquine tablets to the United States, and he threatened, otherwise there will be consequences, you see. And India quickly complied. The issue is not whether India should help any country with medical supplies, medicines when it is required. It is on a threat issued that you are forced to comply. So this is a very unequal relationship. I'd call this India a subordinate ally of the United States at the time of the nuclear deal. And that situation prevails. India is a subordinate ally. And given this asymmetry in the relationship, whatever we do today, it gets distorted. Our economic priorities, our social priorities, our strategic priorities, all get distorted because of this strategic relationship with the United States of America. But that's another matter. I don't think we can go into it at length now.
No, that's true. But I was actually, as you were speaking, I was thinking about the book of your articles that LeftWord produced called Subordinate Ally. And then you mentioned the phrase. I think when you use that phrase in the middle of the nuclear deal debate, it clarified, I think it was a very clarifying phrase, because it showed that the alliance that was being built was totally unequal. And the word you use now is asymmetries. And this has an impact on India's ability to have an independent, not only foreign policy, but also economic policy. The very fact that the Secretary of State in the US is calling up the foreign secretary and saying, listen, you can become part of the supply chain. If India starts to put money to develop things without developing the population, as it were, it's just crazy. You have to start with what's good for the country. It seems to me
you can't buy oil from Iran or Venezuela for that matter. We stopped it long ago now, because Americans said you can't do it. It's totally against our interest to stop buying oil from Iran, which is much cheaper and quicker source. The transportation is also much easier, but we have completely now made it zero purchases from Iran. So anyway, this is one area which will, the coming days, the post-COVID days, we'll have to see how this marriage between Hindutva, authoritarianism, and imperialism plays out.
Quite right. I think that, and you've provided us, with the concepts to understand that, to keep these things front and center, because there's a temptation, I think, to just look inward at the domestic politics without understanding this, the collusion of the Hindutva government with imperialism and so on. I think that context, it's not just a boutique, international relations. It's actually fundamental to the space enabled by the government in India to make policy. I think that's, how many times does the Indian government tell the American government, we don't permit you to do this? I've never heard that before. Thank you very much for joining us at what we are cheekily calling communism, not corona. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.